Afternoon, everyone. So yeah, couldn't keep this down to a trilogy, back by popular demand. This might end up being 5 rather than 4. We'll see, because Rome is a massive topic, and when you've got the prophecies in both Daniel, which are more detailed than the other beasts, and then you've got the prophecies in Revelation that link to that. I wanted to talk this time more about the history, and particularly from Rome up until 70 AD, when you've got the fall of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. So there's a lot of scope to look at what happened to Rome after that and how that goes into modern-day Europe and the Catholic Church and things like that. So, as we know, for those who have watched previous, I think most of you have been here before, this is a series I've been doing where I've been looking at the prophecy in Daniel chapter 2, where Daniel sees a vision of, Daniel, isn't it? It's the king who has the dream of the statue, and each of the parts of the statue represent the different empires to come on the earth following. So at the time it was Babylon, and then it goes to Persia, to Greece, and then now to Rome. The purpose I wanted to do this, because I like ancient world history, and I've sort of done a lot of looking into the ancient cultures and how they connect to the Bible. And I just find that when you read the Bible, sometimes it feels like it's quite isolated, in a sense that everything's happening in Israel, and sometimes it doesn't explain what's happening in the rest of the world. And when you look at some of the history of the rest of the world, it can really give a lot more context to what's happening in the Bible as well. And when people seem to think that the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales, and then you actually look at how it stacks up to history as well, and then you just think, you don't know what you're talking about. And as well, we know that there is a prophecy in Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel sees 4 beasts in succession. And again, these 4 beasts represent the empires on the earth. So the lion is Babylon, the bear is Persia, and etc. And we get to this 4th beast. Now, this is depicted as some kind of dinosaur here. In Daniel, it doesn't actually mention what the beast is itself. It just says it's a terrible beast. In Revelation, it talks about the lizard. I think the dragon. I think part of the reason why it's sometimes depicted as a dinosaur is because the words dragon and dinosaur were kind of interchangeable until about the 1800s. So animals like that would have been seen as dragons. So I just want to look back as well, because what we've seen is a progression of the world. And when you start looking into this, it's amazing how different the world of the Old Testament actually looks to the world of the New Testament. And the Bible doesn't really explain how it gets from one to the other. So Rome is unique in being the only one which is never mentioned in the Old Testament, apart from in prophecy. I think that's mainly because it's just off to one side in Europe, doing its own thing, and then suddenly it comes to power. But so when I started it and we looked at Babylon, this is really the entire world of the Old Testament, and really it's a tiny sliver of the world. And we started looking at how the Garden of Eden was by the Persian Gulf, and then there was the Fertile Crescent, which went across to Israel. But really, when you get to the Babylonian Empire, the world hasn't really expanded that much. So it's very isolated. And the Old Testament, you notice when God called the people of Israel and he gave them the law, he pretty much just told them to stay put in the land. So it's almost the world at the time is very busy as well. You've got these little communities which don't really connect with each other. But then as you move between testaments, so the world between the testaments grows a lot, and you've got the likes of the Persians and the Greek empires. There's a lot more travel, there's a lot more trade, there's a lot more expansion. And then by the time you get to the world of the Romans, suddenly the known world looks like this, which is massively different. And really, what I see when I was looking at this is it feels like God is really setting the stage for the gospel to be spread throughout the world. Because instead of being isolated little communities, suddenly everyone knows a lot more about the world. So obviously the Roman Empire was a big vehicle for the gospel to go out, the spread of ideas, but also when you get into the trading between Asia, the likes of China and India, that went through Turkey and then into Europe. So there was these big trade routes, and I believe it was the Apostle Thomas who went as far as India to spread the gospel as well. One thing that the Bible also doesn't really explain too much, because when you look at the likes of Ezra and Nehemiah, it looks like the Israelites have been released back to their land, and now they're all happy, because the Persians didn't really get too involved with them. But then suddenly in the New Testament they're under the Romans and they want to be free. But when you look really at the history of like the Persians and the Greeks and how much they came in and tried to control the Israelites, and with the Greeks leading to the Maccabean revolt, it paints much more of a picture of how the Israelites really wanted someone to free them from the tyrannical control of other empires, which is why the Jews really wanted to look towards a Messiah who would free them from a political rule rather than bring them the gospel, really. But it's also interesting, again, talking about how God sets the stage for the gospel to be spread out, because really the Roman Empire was a massive conquering force that just sought to control everyone. And the more the empires grew, it sort of shows a growth in man's desire to just see the world and just claim it for himself. So it wasn't just the Israelites who wanted to be free from the Romans, it was basically everyone. And the gospel was spreading out to people who wanted to be free from the control of man. So really, that is a big part of the main reason why the gospel was so freely accepted. So I'm sure we've all seen this image. This is back to the origin of Rome itself. This was in 753 BC, so the legend goes. There were two brothers, Romulus and Remus, and the two of them were like abandoned in a forest or something, and then they were found by a wolf who ended up bringing them up for a little bit, and then they were found by a couple of shepherds who brought them up into adulthood, and then they went off and built a city, and Romulus became the first king of Rome. I think the way the ancient Romans saw this as well was they believed they had a lineage from like the heroes of ancient Greece, because the Romans stole a lot from ancient Greece, so they believed that Romulus and Remus were like descended from Greek or like Trojan heroes, or like they were demigods or something. So their story carried a lot of weight for the Roman people, and we get this period from 753 to about 509 BC, where Rome was entirely controlled by kings. Rome was a bit unusual when you look at a lot of the ancient world, because most of the ancient world, for instance, Egypt, they believed that the pharaohs were all like the reincarnation of the god Horus. So they had this lineage where the pharaoh themselves was like a god in human form. But with the Romans, the kings were actually elected, which I don't think there's any other real case of that. But as we start to see, the Roman kings claimed a lot of power for themselves. So it wasn't just leading the people. It was basically one person having control over everything. And what I've noticed is when you look at almost the characteristics of a society, and sometimes that can permeate throughout its history. And Rome itself seems to be people trying to claim lots of power. So the last emperor was called Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, which is a fantastic name. He simultaneously held the titles of head of state, head of government. He was the chief judge, the commander-in-chief of the army, the chief legislator, the chief priest. And there's a lot of similarities I find to like the Roman emperors and then later on the Pope. This is like the original Pontifex Maximus. Because there was a Senate at the time, but it was only really there to vote in the kings, so it was all the kings who had the real power. So in 509 BC, we get this real change. The Greeks had kind of brought out this idea of democracy, which they tried and tested a bit in Athens, but it was the Romans who really took it on and made it their own, and they created this system, the Republic, which actually managed to last about 500 years, which is one of the most successful political systems ever made, actually. But it was a very convoluted system, and part of the reason was because they wanted to make sure that no one ever took the same amount of power again as the kings did. So you've got all these different branches of government. The highest official in the Republic was the consul, and they were elected every year, and there were always two of them. So it was just a way of making sure that, again, no one person was in control. The only time that someone did take control was when the city was in crisis, and then someone would come up as the dictator, and then that person would basically be given temporary command over everything to protect the city, usually by taking control of the armies and defending it. And then as soon as the crisis was over, they would give the power back to the people. But obviously, as time went on, people became more ambitious and they understood more how to subvert the system and then take control, which is what happens when you get the rise of the empire. So this is just a bit of a time frame as well, because I know people like my timeline, so I have to put at least one, and Monica's nodding there, so I have to put at least one into every one. This is just showing sort of the time span of the Republic itself and how it fits into some of the other main bits I've been talking about. So this was 510, or well, sometimes it's 510, sometimes it's 509. So that would have been about a generation after the Persian edict was sent out to allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And then you get the decade, well, the centuries going on where the Israelites were able to come home, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and then you get Alexander the Great. And then it's really when you get to the 2nd century BC that Rome really starts to come onto the scene. So this is around the time of the Maccabean revolt. Because as the Greeks really started to take power with the trade in the Mediterranean, the Romans wanted a piece of that too. And Athens Rome and Carthage, which is in North Africa, was really the main powerhouses. So Rome ended up conquering Athens and Carthage in a series of wars pretty much in the same year, which meant that they were now the top people in the Mediterranean and could control the whole world. So this became the foundation of the Roman Empire. And then we get 63 BC when General Pompey conquers Jerusalem. And then it's not too long after that that the empire begins to really come into play. The Roman Senate is no longer has the power that it used to, and then we get back to a point where you've got the emperor and one person being in control of Rome and indeed the world. So I just wanted to talk about this because, so when I was doing the Greeks, I talked about the idea of the ideal man. So the Greeks believed that they had this very almost American ideal about things where it was all for show and heroes and theatre. So they had gyms everywhere and people would train, they'd become muscly, they'd become strong. These were like the ideal protectors of the empire. But Rome was a lot more about the family. Soldiers weren't people who'd been to the gym and trained. They were just normal people, normal like fathers who'd worked on the land. And they'd grown strength through working rather than training, which is a very different thing. And it also, when you've got the ideals of the Republic giving power to the people, you see how people no longer are just believe in a king or a god. It's more about an idea. And Rome, just like the Greeks, it was about bringing this sense of civilization to people. You know, Rome had the great technology. They had these great ideals of peace and power for everyone rather than just one king being at the top. So when Rome conquered people, a lot of people actually enjoyed being under Roman rule because it actually meant there was a lot of freedom for them than they had before. For instance, what we see in the book of Acts when Paul is on trial, he talks about how he is a Roman citizen, and because he says that, suddenly they treat him differently because they assume that he's just a conquered person, but because he's a Roman citizen, that means he has rights. So again, this was something that the Romans allowed people to do. It wasn't just taking people over and controlling them like the likes of the Babylonians would do. It was welcoming them into a community, which, as I said, often had better education, better technology. But when we start to get into the imperial days, again, it was more about just controlling people, which is why people suddenly wanted to be free, because they realized what they'd actually entered into. Just wanted to mention this as well. So this was another important thing about the Roman home, because Roman religion took on a lot of things that were very ancient, and they went back to the likes of the Babylonian times. And there was this goddess called Vesta, who was the goddess of the home and of flame, fire. And one very important and very ancient part of Roman civilization was they had this temple of the goddess Vesta, and they would bring in this group of virgin priestesses who would constantly be in the temple, and they would keep the fire burning. And it was kind of a cult that went right throughout the lifespan of the Roman Empire. But when you actually look into it, it seems kind of coincidental that then when the Roman Empire adopts Christianity and Catholicism, then suddenly you get this worshipping of a virgin as well. And it's one of those aspects of Roman culture that you clearly see move over into their version of Christianity. So just a little, I don't want to go too much into like just talking about history, but it sort of goes in line with the setup I've been doing. So a lot of people know this story. It's been made very famous by the likes of Shakespeare. But talking of the Roman democracy and the dictator, so Julius Caesar in 49 BC, he famously he gained a lot of power as a military leader in Europe, and then the Senate told him to come back and relinquish his power, but he refused. So he led this army back to Rome, and he was crossing the river, and he said, "The die is cast." And then he brought his armies back to Rome, and all the Senate ended up fleeing. So Caesar just came in, was able to take power, and he made himself dictator for life. And there was this massive resistance of the people to try and stop him becoming dictator, because people still wanted to uphold the old days of the Republic. And then 5 years after he became dictator, in 44 BC, a load of the senators ended up murdering him. And then there was this big conflict of people on one side trying to bring the Senate back, and on the other side, people were trying to push in a new person to become the new emperor, which ended up being Augustus in 27 BC, who is mentioned in the book of Luke, of course, the one who gives the decree for the census around the birth of Jesus. Another thing to note is that people saw Julius Caesar as a god himself. So he sort of goes back to this idea of an ancient king. And Augustus began the lineage of, he was like a demigod, because he was the inherited son of Julius Caesar himself. And then, of course, this really sets the scene for Jesus to come. When you really look at Jesus, because it's amazing how, obviously, the Bible puts him in great detail, but outside of the Bible, he's really just an insignificant man in an insignificant country of a massive empire. And there's really no reason, historically, looking at just man's ability, why Jesus would have been anywhere near as big and influential as he ended up being. When people talk about the Bible being fairy tales, I sometimes wonder if partly what they think is that it's almost set in a real place, but it's not, like, it doesn't actually exist in history. Because I know there are some fairy tales where you look back, like the original story of Aladdin. It was set in a place called China, but it wasn't anything like the actual China. I wonder if people think that's what it's like with Jesus as well. But as we heard last week as well, when you actually look back to the likes of Herod and Pontius Pilate, these people are very specifically mentioned in the Bible, and it gives a lot of detail on the timescales of them in power and when Jesus was around, and like the setting of him around these people who are in power at the time. So we've got Herod, we've got Herod Antipas, we've got Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest, Pontius Pilate, and when you look at these people, you can very clearly place Jesus' life on top of them. And when you've got the likes of many people writing, the likes of Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and many others who weren't even Jewish writers. Some were Roman, some were... actually, I think most of them were Roman. There might have been the odd Greek one as well. It really nails in this idea that Jesus was very definitely a historical figure. In fact, I've heard it said that Jesus, there's more definite historical fact to say that Jesus was alive than even the likes of Shakespeare, because some people think that Shakespeare was multiple people because one person couldn't have written all those plays. And then, of course, when you see what happened after Jesus, because Jesus himself, he didn't leave his country, so really the effect is what happened after he was crucified, and then the gospel is spread right throughout the empire. What seems like a little event, the crucifixion of one man, ends up being a springboard for a massive movement. And even just the first century and the journeys of Paul. So this is within one generation of the death of Jesus, and suddenly, right throughout the Roman world, you can see all these churches start to bloom, which again, it boggles the human mind how quickly a movement could carry through and become so popular when these people didn't even have internet and social media and things. Because just as well, so I found this image. This is just a timeline of world religion, and we can ignore the bottom bits a bit because they're more Asian, so they East Asian. They haven't changed a lot. But what you notice with the top bit, so this is where you've got all these religions of the likes of the Middle East, Europe, and as soon as Christianity comes into play, you see the North line, suddenly all these religions, all these pagan religions start to pass away, and Christianity really starts to take hold. And it's amazing how the world just shifts towards Christianity. And again, I like to think that one of the best reasons I have to believe in the gospel is because God's in charge of history. And you can really see the spread of the gospel, the spread of the word of the Lord, really shows you that the Lord has been in charge of the whole thing. But of course, when the gospel started to rise up, so did the retaliation to the gospel. The Romans were very unhappy that this movement that said that someone else was a god, came as a god in human form and was people's saviour. They were very angry that this became so popular, so they had to find ways to eliminate them. And the persecution against Christianity was very horrible, to put it lightly. The likes of Nero was really the one who started it off big time, and there's the famous story where he basically set fire to Rome, and then, you know, the legend goes that he played the fiddle while the city was burning, and then when it finished, he ended up blaming it on the Christians just so he could use his forces to try and purge them. But that didn't work. The gospel continued to grow until, it was 330 odd when Constantine ended up making Christianity the official religion of the empire. But again, it just shows you how even when you try and keep the gospel down, it still manages to rise up. There's a famous legend about the Polycarp, who was a 2nd century Christian. Apparently, the Romans tried to basically burn him at the stake, but the fire wouldn't consume him, and so they had to bring the sword out. And his famous last line was, "For 86 years have I been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I now blaspheme my king who saved me?" Which again, it shows you how good we have it really in our modern world. And that persecution ended up becoming so strong that the Romans themselves ended up stepping in and basically destroying Jerusalem. So it started off as a Jewish revolt in 66 AD, just like with the Greeks. The Romans got a bit too involved in Jewish tradition, so the Jews ended up rebelling against them, and then a few years later the Romans sent their entire army in to basically control things, and a load of people who came into the city for Passover, they basically stopped them leaving the city, and then they basically meant that they couldn't get any supplies into the city anymore, so the people ended up starving and turning on each other, and then the Romans came in and destroyed stuff. So again, terrible part of history, but again it lines up with prophecy in Matthew 24. Jesus talks about the fall of the temple. He says, "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down," and that does fulfill prophecy with what happened at the siege. So historically, I'll just end it here because I know it's getting on a bit and people are probably very tired. But there's one bit I wanted to particularly mention about the more prophetic side, because if we look at Revelation chapter 13, again, it doesn't really explain what this beast is. So this is just an artist's idea of what it might look like. But one thing it says when it's talking about this beast is it talks about how it has parts. So it's like unto a leopard, feet were of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. And if you remember back, so these three beasts, the lion represents Babylon in Daniel's vision, the bear represents Persia, and the leopard represents Greece. So we can clearly see that there are elements of all three of the previous empires which are meant to be seen in Rome. And as I said, Rome really went around and collected a lot of things from the nations and the religions around it. So you can clearly see how a lot of the Babylonian religion came down into Rome, for instance. They worshipped a lot of the same kind of gods. They were sort of inherited and passed down. Persia, you can clearly see how Rome took a lot of Persia's like ruling style, the way they managed the empire. But also you've got the likes of Persian religion came into Rome, and I think it's the cult of Mithra. There was this cult that came into Roman religion and mixed with it, and that's part of the reason why they changed the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday to be Sunday, because part of the cult of Mithra was worshipping the sun. And there are still people today who think that that is one of the biggest cardinal sins of the Catholic Church. And then Greece, you get a lot of the religion, you get a lot of the philosophy. I believe there's quite a lot of influence from the likes of Aristotle that goes into a lot of Catholic theology. So it's not just what God says, what the Bible says. It's also what these Greek philosophers say, and we'll chuck that in as well. And just another one I wanted to mention, because this is the last slide now. You might be happy to know. So this is a picture or an artist's impression from the book Dante's Inferno, which was written in the 1300s. So many of us probably know this, well, there's this idea that Dante wrote in this where he goes into hell with this Greek prophet Virgil, and there's a lot of Greek mythology there. Again, they go down the river Styx, which is a very Greek underworld idea. But there's the 9 circles of hell, and each one represents a different level of sin. And they get to the bottom layer, and it's the level of betrayal. And he sees this big vision of Satan on a frozen lake. And it talks about how Satan is chewing these 3 people constantly for eternity. And those 3 people he sees, the poet says that they're basically the 3 biggest betrayers in history. And one of them, as you might expect, is Judas Iscariot. But the other 2 are Brutus and Cassius, who are two of the main people who were instrumental in the assassination of Julius Caesar. So I find it very interesting that they almost place the betrayal of Jesus on the same level as the betrayal of Julius Caesar, who is like the original God in human form of the Roman Empire. So it's a very interesting intertwining of these 2, the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire. So I'll just leave it there. Probably to be continued. I'll do a bit more on the end of the Roman Empire and how that feeds into the modern world, I guess. But yes, thank you for listening. Tom, could you close this meeting today with a word of prayer, please?